Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Sarah Krotz, the Interim Director of the Canadian Literature Centre at the University of Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 land and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. This area has been a gathering place of diverse Indigenous nations since time immemorial, and I'm grateful that we can continue to gather here, albeit virtually, today. In partnership with the Wright program in the Department of English and Film Studies, and with the support from the Canada Council for the Arts, we are delighted to bring you this reading and conversation today with Karina Vernon and Bertrand Bickersteth, introduced and moderated by Uchechukwu Umezurike. Uchechukwu Umezurike holds a PhD from the University of Alberta. He is an award-winning literary critic with research interests in post-colonial and Black diaspora literatures, gender, sexuality, and cultural studies. Uche is also, as many of you know, an accomplished creative writer and poet. He co-edited Wreaths for Wayfarers, an anthology of poems, and last year published a children's book, Wishmaker, and a short story collection, Double Wahala, Double Trouble. Uche, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's an honor for me to be sharing this space with two powerful writers and thinkers, Karina Vernon and Bertrand Bickersteth. I've always admired their incredible work and the amazing interventions they do for Black literature and culture in particular. Karina and Bertrand, your work fills me with so much hope and, more importantly, make me appreciate the urgency for all of us to keep fighting against the erasure of Black narratives by hegemonic cultural formations in Canada. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce our writers. Karina Vernon is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto Scarborough, where she researches and teaches in the areas of Canadian and Black Canadian literature, Black aesthetics, archives, critical pedagogy, and Black-Indigenous solidarities. She's the editor of the Black Prairie Archives, an anthology published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press in 2020, and a forthcoming companion volume titled Critical Readings in the Black Prairie Archives. I can't wait to get a copy of that book. Currently, Karina is working with Winfried Siemerling at the University of Waterloo on a book project on the politics and aesthetics of relation of Black Canadian cultural achievements, including writing, music, film, and visual arts. Now introduce Bertrand Bickersteth, who is a poet, playwright, essayist, and educator who was born in Sierra Leone, Africa, raised in Alberta, partly educated in the US, and has resided in the US for several years. In 2021, CBC named Bertrand a Black writer to watch. His collection of poetry, The Response of Weeds, was a finalist for multiple awards and won the League of Canadian Poets, Gerard Lampert's Memorial Award, the Writers Guild of Alberta's Stephen G. Stephenson Award for Poetry, and the 2021 High Plains Book Award in the category of First Book. He has been a contributor/columnist for CBC's The Next Chapter, as well as the CBC project's Black on the Prairies. His most recent work was published in the Walrus Poetry and the Sprawl essay. His TED Talks is called The Weight of Words, and you can watch it on YouTube. Bertrand is currently working on a new collection of poetry highlighting the history of Black cowboys in Western Canada, and I believe he's going to share an excerpt from that work this afternoon. He lives in Calgary, teaches at Oates College, and writes about Black identity on the prairies. Please join me in welcoming Karina Vernon and Bertrand Bickersteth to share their amazing works with us. Thank you.
I did my postdoc at the University of Alberta, and so I remember attending these events myself as a student. And I remember Stephen Slemmon's, joyous introduction of every author, and I never imagined that I would be in this space myself. And so it's just a thrill to be here. Thank you so much. So I picked out some sections to read from the book. I would just begin by reading something from the introduction. So my introduction is kind of an orientation to the Black Prairie Archives. And the thing about this book is that I theorize the Black Prairie Archives as a phenomenon through the writing. And so I was thinking with the work of like Bertrand Bickersteth and all the other writers. And so maybe I'll begin with this and then move on to something else. Writing between 1872 and 2019, Black authors reveal the key role race has played in shaping the prairies as a region, politically, culturally, and ideologically. Black Prairie writers shed light on the long Black presence on the prairies, but also the process by which the region gained identity as a political, social, and above all, ideological formation by rejecting this presence and producing it as the outside boundary that defined the legitimate spaces of the region. Black writers produced the prairies differently, not as a vast, empty, or null space, but as a place that is connected to and transformed by its relation to the Black world, including to the transatlantic slave trade and resulting cultures and networks of the Black Atlantic. Black writers figure the prairies alternatively as an inland ocean, as a crossroads, as a space that is membrane-like, alive, a continuous flux in motion. Far from being empty, this diasporized Black prairie rings with the songs, spirits, languages, and stories of Africa and its diasporas. In these Black prairies, we find the desert jinn or genies. We encounter the red woman, the haunting embodiment of plantation injustice. We hear the Ugandan folklore tale of Nsimbigewire. We hear stories and verse in Arabic, Bantu, Ebonics, Creole, Portuguese, Swahili, and many more. Black authors write the prairies as a crucial site for radical experiments in Black community and citizenship, as well as experiments in racial identification, literary genre, and voice. It is, quote, a central space of inspiration, but also an unwilling muse, as Bertrand Bickersteth puts it. The prairies is a geography intimately loved, but it is also a fraught racial relation. It is a site of dislocation, of repressed Black histories, but also it is the future. The Black prairies, for many of these writers, come into being on the space of the page as a network of diasporic and local influences. Above all, the Black prairies is this archive, an open-ended and still unfinished space. So that's just a little bit from the introduction as I try to orient the reader to this archive and some of its aesthetics and concerns. I thought that I would just read one text from the first Black writer, the first archival Black writer that I found, the person who started everything for me. This is a piece of writing by Daniel T. Williams, whose dates are approximately 1840 to 1887. Dan Williams is a complicated figure and hard to follow through the archives. There are so many stories and misrepresentations about him. So I had to disentangle the myths and the legends from a different kind of person I was encountering in the archive. As far as I could tell, Dan Williams was born in Kingston, Canada West, and traveled west across the prairies as a translator and cook for the famous John Palliser expedition, which was surveying the prairies from 1857 to 1860 for possible routes for the Canadian Pacific Railway. So that is how he ended up in the Peace River District as a farmer and writer. So he kept a notebook during his time in the Peace River, and it's an agricultural notebook. And he shared a fragment of this notebook with surveyors, Dominion surveyors that were looking around. You just find things in the unlikeliest of places. So I found this fragment from his notebook in an agricultural government document called Province of Manitoba and Northwest Territory of the Dominion of Canada, Information for Immigrants. This document might not be impressive to anybody looking at it. It is a series of very short sentences. But for me, this is a tremendously moving piece of writing because in it, I see Dan Williams as a reader, and he's not reading a text or a book, but he's reading the land, this Peace River district, reading it for, kind of taking a reading of the climate, of the weather, of the land, of the seasons, and thereby kind of articulating a kind of a relationship with this place. And one of his entries takes place on February 18th, 1875. So today is February 18th. So I found that just, this is the power of kind of archival documents that they can reach out of their own historical moment and speak to our moment, our particular place and time. So I'll just read it. It's quite short. Notebook, 1872 to 1875. 1872. Ice began to run in river November 8th. River closed November 28th. First snow, October 28th. 1873. April 23rd, ice moved out of river. Planted potatoes, April 25th. First permanent snow, November 2nd. River closed, November 30th. 1874. River broke up, 19th April. First geese came, 21st April. Sowed barley and oats, April 22nd. River cleared of upper ice, May 3rd. Planted potatoes, May 5th. Potatoes not injured by frost until 22nd September. Then snow fell, which covered them, but soon went off. Dug over 100 bushels from one planting. Ice commenced to run in river, October 30th. River closed, November 23rd. Snowed all night, November 4th. 1875. Ice broke up in the river, April 15th. Warm rains from northwest, blue flies and rain, February 18th. Ice cleared out in front of fort, April 16th. Potatoes planted, 8th, 9th, and 10th of May. Barley and oats sown, May 7th. Snow all gone before the middle of April. This applies to both the river valley and the level country above. That's it. That's his relationship and reading of the climate, new to him. But there he is writing his way into that particular geography. And for me, as the opening sort of text of the archive, it just bespeaks this important relationship. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that. Thanks for listening.
I just wanted to say how beautifully read that was. I mean, you read it so beautifully. It was like poetry, absolutely was. And I remember when I first saw that text, I actually conceived of beginning to write poetry when I saw that text. So I think it's wonderful that you brought this up. I thought you were going to, read the other text that's associated with him, but what a beautiful move. As people who love literature and who love language, when you see this text and you see the way it's lined up, that it's so much vertical text as opposed to the normal horizontal lines, it feels like poetry. And of course, we are so tantalized by what we don't get as much as what we do get, right? So we get April and then November, and it's sort of like, what the heck happened in between there, right? And that very much, I think, fills our need for Black presence, while at the same time frustrating us in those very familiar ways for what we can't know or can never encounter. I think that was lovely that you read that. That was a brilliant idea. Thank you so much.
This is stunning that you say that you started writing poetry in response to reading his notebook. So first of all, you know that his notebook was probably never intended to be read in the way that we're reading it, but it's pulling poetry out of you, right? And so the importance of the archive, for that reason, writing begets more writing.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Now, I should point out, I didn't plan to write poetry after I read that, but it felt very evocative to me. And I tried to write a poem around that. I wanted to imitate that style, that kind of vertical style, and all those lacunae in there as well. And it never came off. It didn't work. All I could do is think of potatoes. I had this image of potatoes and I couldn't make it work. But I think it's so much better that you just read it. But you're exactly right, though. I mean, this is the beauty of mining the archives and having them public. Writing begets writing. You wrote an entire anthology in part because you encountered this text in part. And I think that's wonderful. And it is part of the beauty. It's part of the frustration too, because, you know, as we've just talked about, there are many gaps and there's missing information. And then some things we find are not that great, but it's part of the process as well. Yeah. So yeah, he did inspire me. You're right. He did.
I'm just speechless by the rich, evocative, not just only how Daniel wrote and the beauty in those fragmented recollections of nature, of geography, of even the weather. And I was just thinking about the kind of detail to a sort of cartographic curating of nature he was doing at the time. And of course, the way Karina read it, so beautifully rendered. And I was just thinking, oh, maybe I could write a poem that has this sort of vertical / even horizontal, because I was also looking at it in terms of its a sort of horizon, not just looking at it in terms of its vertical pattern, but in terms of the horizon and then the image of the geese and the blue flies, and how I can also maybe conjure some certain images around those in my own poem, my own poetry. And so I really appreciate giving us this aliveness, even though we're talking about the past, but there's so much aliveness in what you just shared. And so Bertrand, I'm looking forward to what you're going to read right now. If you don't mind.
I'm going to change what I'm going to read. I had all these plans, and now I'm just going to change that entirely, because that was such a lovely way to open things up. That was such an evocative poem that I think the only the right thing for me to read is my Daniel Williams poem, I think, in response, I think. And so this is the poem that did eventually come, but it's nothing like, I can't even find it because I didn't mark this out. It's nothing like what I had tried to do originally. Oh, table of contents. So as Karina pointed out, Daniel was in Peace Country. It was where he was operating in this middle part of the 19th century. And when we think of the Peace Country, I think often when we think about the uniqueness of the Peace Country, part of what we think of is the Francophone communities that were out there, and the interactions between the Francophone and the Indigenous communities, and as well as the lack of border between what does eventually become British Columbia and then much later on Alberta during fur trading and things like that. So I think it's just a lovely addition that we've got this guy, Daniel Williams, who, as Karina pointed out, is a complex figure. He's not the hero that we all want to see. And also he is, I think fittingly, after that reading, he is filled with lacunae. He's filled with gaps and spaces in his story. It's just so hard to know exactly who he is, who he's from. I appreciate all the research you've been doing, Karina, to try to figure that out, because I know that's very difficult to do. So good luck with that and carry on. So I'm going to read this poem called The Peace. I'm still thinking about that reading, Karina. All those images of rivers, which I also feel strongly drawn to, and the ways in which rivers kind of help to connect us through that geography in early pioneering days and exploration days, and how often Dan Williams would be talking about the river and the ice on the river, and the river is iced, the river is not iced. That's still resonating with me. So this happens to be a river poem, this one. Several of the poems in the collection focus on rivers. A lot of them focus on fields too, but most people seem to enjoy the river poems anyway, so I'll do this one. This one is called The Peace, and it's about the Peace River, but of course it's really about Dan Williams and Blackness in Alberta. The Peace. It is 1873, flowing along the Peace, from its source waters to Greater Slave Lake, to the mighty Mackenzie, to the patient body of the Arctic. Along the way at Fort St. John, what do you see? A raving Negro, silently signifying angry, but too far away for you to heed. Something about claiming native land before the Hudson's Bay Company's claim. It is perhaps the way of things up here, up north in Canada, to tolerate his noise and then try to drown it with your peace. But Negro Dan would know something about a basinal baptism, with his bottomless Bible and his ready quotes mussing up your headwaters, signifying angry. Is it his fault that he reads so much like a river Caliban, projecting his peaceful poxes, forcing you to take notice? Have you never wondered where these headwaters begin? Legend has it that he married a beaver chief's daughter, who was struck mute until that Northwest Mounted Police bullet struck her down before it could strike her spirit husband, crying, "Stop." He is only too aware that this peace eventually becomes the slave, an easing confluence that confuses complaint in this country that always empties quietly northward. And here, finally, is Peace Point, the zone we can never escape, the collision of the slave and the peace, a Canadian confounding that roils unpronounced under Dan's proclamation. Let me translate for him. This is my piece of country, if you know what's good for you. Watch your step. It was a little shaky reading, sorry guys. I wasn't planning on reading that one. A little shaky, but thank you, Karina, for reminding me of that very important character.
Thank you so much for that reading. And yeah, that was a great pairing. Thank you so much for following that river, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Well, you inspired it. I had not remembered that Dan Williams text for a long time. And you reading it in that poetic way just evoked it. It seemed necessary for me to respond.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful, wonderful. Yeah.
So I see you both as memory keepers, and the way you conjure the past to show how it's connected to this moment and then this future. And one of the things that struck me in Bertrand's evocation of the Peace River is that collision between the specter of slavery and the traces of colonial violence that still somehow saturate this moment. So I'm thinking about how you work with archival documents and text and memory keeping as justice work, and given how you both call attention to spatial justice issues affecting Black lives on the prairies. So my question would be, what would you say has been your greatest challenge in the field?
Uche, I'm really struck by this phrase that you use, spatial justice. That's such a resonant phrase, and I guess I want to pick up on that. I think that phrase really goes to the heart of what it means to do archival work, to bring out of the archives these documents that attest to such a long Black presence on the prairies, but one that's denied in the dominant historical accounts and sort of popular imaginings of what the prairies is and what prairie literature is. What the documents show is that the prairies as a social space has been produced, right? It's not neutral. It's not like some kind of neutral space. It's been produced. And in terms of spatial justice, right, it's been produced in such a way to exclude Black folks from, how can I say, exclude Black folks from sort of just, Blackness, and the prairies are two concepts that I had a hard time at the outset of my research in holding together in one thought. I didn't even have the language or the framework in order to think those things together, Blackness and the prairies. So that's one of the challenges. When you ask what have been the challenges, even thinking the Black prairies, even thinking about Blackness as a long-standing phenomenon, having to invent the language to name the experience. I think that was one of the challenges. But when now that I'm on the other side and the book is out, and I think about what have been like the main difficulties, the main challenges of the project, for me, it's been the question of responsibility. Bertrand knows how long I sat with this project and how long it took me to publish it. Oh my God, I sat with it and researched more and sat with it longer and reframed it and recast it and double checked and checked in with the writers, because I didn't know if I was doing justice to the stories, to the histories. And I felt, what if I get it wrong? What if I get it wrong? And I have my particular perspective on Black Prairie history and experience, but it's a limited one. It's my own sort of individual one. And my family came in the 1980s, and that's sort of my experience of it. And I'm not part of that community of Black pioneer descendants, right, who have their own sort of take on the history, and they've got their own sort of stories and archive. And so I thought, for me, that was the difficulty. If people are going to trust me with their histories and their documents, I've got to be sure that I'm getting it right. So for me, the question of responsibility and justice to their stories was paramount.
Yeah, very, very evocative ideas there. I was not sure how to answer this question exactly. My feeling when I heard the words memory keeper, story keeper, I instantly think of my mother, actually, because in my family, that's her role, one of her many roles. So when I seek stories to understand my familial place of belonging, I go to my mother. And in fact, even when I'm trying to figure out things on my dad's side of the family, I go to my mother. She is that much of the keeper. He always says, oh, I don't remember, blah, 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 right? And she knows more about his family's past and that sort of thing. She actually is the keeper. And so I almost never instinctively think of justice in that sense. I think of my mother, and I think of community, and I think of the necessity of gathering and keeping stories so that they can be maintained and then dispersed as they should be. But when you phrased it, I too was struck by spatial justice as well. And it reminded me of the challenge that I had when I was, well, that I always have when I go through archives. And to a certain extent, maybe, Karina, I've side-skirted this issue because I chose poetry, where you can kind of play around with things. You don't have to worry too much about representation in the same way that you did, because I certainly struggle with that as well. I think it's absolutely a valid thing to think of. My struggle has always been the unwillingness of the muse, I guess, as we talked about before. Yes, I want to reveal these histories to people. But as Karina suggested, the space is never neutral. It's not. And history itself is one of these discursive practices that we get through national narratives and things like that. So we're always trying to build the nation in a particular way, and history tells us that. And of course, many of us have come to learn that history is not telling us that. History is not helping us out with the past at all. We're getting something that is absolutely not neutral when we are getting that national expression of the past, that version of quote unquote history. And so on the one hand, I always felt as though it was important for me to mine the archives and reveal these things to the public as a kind of check, obviously, as a way of including that which has been unneutrally, if that's a word, excluded. On the other hand, I've always struggled with myself, and this is the big challenge. It's an internal struggle. I've always struggled with myself regarding the ultimate motivation for revealing these things out to the wider public. Yes, of course, I believe in the edification of the public, and I believe that it is important that they recognize the place of Blackness within the formative discourses and narratives of this province and this country. That's super important, definitely. But if I'm going to be honest with myself, there is an emotional, a personal factor that's included as well, that has to do with, say, that kid who was 5 years old who had a horrible experience on the playground because he thought he was just playing with friends who thought and felt about the space that they live in exactly the same way he did, but then discovered that they see him as completely different, completely alien. And I think I often respond to that feeling, as old as it is, as immature as it is. And so, yes, I do want to get those things out there for good reason, but in part, I think I also want to try to, or at least I question, am I just trying to prove I belong? And in that sense, I think the challenge is, do I want to be complicit in being a part of this building a narrative? Am I just challenging it as I think, or am I, in using history, which is a part of that whole project, as part of many colonial projects, in engaging it, am I somehow also being complicit in creating something that I don't want to be a part of? Yeah. So yes, Alberta is my unwilling muse in more than one way. The challenge for me was to try to reconcile these feelings between the intellectual me who wants to reveal these things and the emotional child me who just wants to belong, and the risk of maybe courting that thing out there that creates these narratives in such a way that ultimately does exclude. That's the big challenge for me. I'm sorry I waffled on with it, but I got personal.
Thank you for sharing that, Bertrand, and speaking so frankly and honestly about the histories we carry with us as Black Prairie people. I don't think there's any of us that don't walk with that. There's none of us that don't carry what you've described. All of us have been shaped and misshaped in those ways. And it does compel you to enter the archive. You know, if the story that you inherit about yourself is a story of Blackness doesn't exist on the prairies, it's there's no Black history here, you're an anomaly. There's something about going into the archive, right? And finding all the receipts. I did feel that way every time. Like I was like gathering all the receipts. And I remember when my book came out of, like, when my box of books arrived from the press, opened them up, and I saw, because I'd never seen like what's it going to look like? Well, like what's the final shape of the book, you know? And I picked it up, you know. I picked it up and I was like, that's my answer. You know, dropping the receipts, that's my answer. So I do understand, and I share with you that feeling of feeling you need to answer, which maybe we shouldn't have to answer, you know, at all, that feeling. But there's something really transformative and reparative about going into the archives, or in your case, right, like producing your writing, like writing and publishing, and yeah, it's transformative, both of ourselves and I think of the space.
Yeah, well put again. Yeah, shaped and misshaped. Perfect. That's exactly right. That's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Oh, well, there's so much to unpack from all these insights you've shared with me and everyone here present. And I was just thinking about the kind of interweaving links between narratives, history, even alienation, and how Blackness seems to weave itself through these connections. And it got me into a space to really think about a lot, and I hope I can do some writing out of this wealth of personal and public knowledge you've shared. I feel very humbled by the depth and the richness of this conversation, and I'm saying this with all sincerity, and I really appreciate what you've just offered me, because I'm barely 6 years old, living in Canada. I just and it's in the last few years I've been thinking why being cocooned in academic, but I've also been thinking about what it means to be here and what it means to be ordered, because back home in Africa, no one orders you, and people, we really don't think about racism or Blackness. We think in terms of maybe ethnicity, Igbo, for Nigeria, Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, and then the other ethnic groups. And of course, we're all the same color and maybe different shades of skin color, but then we're not contained or even constrained by racist ideologies or structures. And so thank you very much for sharing all this.
Yeah. I also wanted to just add something too that Karina brought to mind. I love the receipts as well, and thank you for that. It's, you know, that's so true. That's so true. So you say you got your box and you saw your book, yeah? But I want to tell you that when I got your book, I felt the same way as well. And I think that's the value too that we don't understand about our writings and going through the archives and things like that. I think that, and Uche, this links to what you just said too. I think because on this continent, Blackness just orders you instantly. You're just thrown into this order instantly. I think one of the positive sides of that is that we can relate. And so your success, Karina, feels like my success. It feels that way. And it teaches me to feel the success of that as well. And so, yeah, receipts, fantastic. Thank you.
I'm terribly moved by what you've said, both of you. Well, the book is a community, right? That's what it is. It's a community, and it's trying to show the links between us, I think. You know, the link that you talked about, Bertrand, that reading Daniel Williams' writing, you know, pulled writing out of you. And I did feel as I was in the archives and looking for writers that I was finding kin, you know, not blood kin, but literary kin, spatial kin. And so it is a community. That's how I think about it.
It is, I agree. I think of it that way as well. Yeah. This is our community.
I just want to thank you thank all three of you for this amazing, illuminating conversation, and Karina and Bertrand for your readings. I was so excited. I've been so excited about this event, partly because I'm living in Alberta, and it does just deepen and add these complexities to my own sense of this place and what it means to be here, to read a book like this. And I grew up on the prairies too, in Manitoba. Yeah, I really appreciate this work, and I love the idea of an anthology as a community too in this context. It's so meaningful. I was struck also, as someone who has, myself, I've done work on the intersections between literature and mapping in Canada and the expanding settlement, and these expeditions. You mentioned, Daniel Williams was part of the Palliser expedition, and these expeditions that were framed as, or sort of, at least retrospectively, kind of part of this white settler legacy, right? And they were never white. Like they were always diverse, these expeditions and these communities that were sort of moving in these ways across the land and relating in very different ways to the land. So I was just also really moved by your reading, Karina, of that text from Williams, which is so profoundly engaged with the landscape and the climate and all of that. What I wondered, and I want to ask this of both of you, and I know, Uche, this is something you're thinking about in your postdoctoral work too, I think, but I was wondering about how, in thinking about spatial justice and these stories that are so important to kind of draw out in order to create a certain kind of new spatial justice, how you have considered that relationship between Black Canadian history and Black writers in Canada and Indigenous sovereignties in these same spaces. So I don't know if I'm sure if there's particular moments where you encountered, thinking that through in both of your work, because I know you do think both very much about land, so I'd love to hear you talk about it.
This is a really important question, Sarah. And gosh, I don't know, where should I begin thinking about it? For me, this was one of the hardest things to think through. Well, just even thinking about Dan Williams on that land. He's writing himself into a relationship with the land. But the land is Indigenous land. He's revealing his non-indigeneity in that piece of writing, his unfamiliarity, and that's totally clear. He doesn't know that land. He doesn't know the way the seasons move. He's displaced. At the same time, it's very hard to think through questions of Black affective relationship to place. Because that is also stolen land at the same time. So one of the things that the archive shows me again and again is how Black folks displaced from Africa, right? And then often further displaced on Turtle Island within the continent, have moved into deep and abiding relationships with particular geographies, but it's always fraught, right? It's always fraught because that land is stolen. And so one of the challenges of thinking about Black being and being long on the prairies is, how do we think about Black belonging on the prairies while also uplifting Indigenous sovereignty over ancestral lands, on ancestral lands, and thinking about that relationship that is, I think that's such a key in thinking about that relationship. And also thinking about Black Afro-Indigenous identities on the prairies too, that the story is way more complicated, way more complicated than I initially understood when I began the research. like you say, Sarah, relationships have been triangulated in all kinds of ways. Like Black folks were there on the ground floor in many instances of the colonial project. And how do you think that through? Yeah, that's, I carry that question.
I don't think there's much I can add to that, frankly. I mean, that is it in a nutshell, the question of Black belonging. And I suppose to a certain extent, I was hinting at this with my previous response to spatial justice, that engaging some of these narratives just to belong to a narrative that was produced through a colonial project, I now can become complicit in that project. And indeed, as Karina pointed out, when Black presences first emerge in contact with Indigenous communities, often it's through the encountering of white people and bringing that colonial project about. And so, from the start, the hint of that complicity is already there. It's already there. Now, Black people and the history of Black presences is obviously more complicated than, we were just along with white people and so we're just as bad or whatever, right? It's much more complicated than that. And there are even some people who claim that, there is no issue when it comes to Black people being on Turtle Island because it was not of their doing or of their making to begin with. But still, there are responsibilities we still have to think through. We can't just leave it at that. And so, yes, I find it a very difficult question. I agree with Karina that we should try to find ways of mining those archives, expunging the negative things or expelling the negative things and portraying or representing those histories that have been missed before, but always with a mind to raising awareness or simply raising Indigenous experiences and histories as well. And that is just tricky because part of those things that we were involved in were part of the colonial project. They simply were. I was also going to talk about the Afro-Indigenous connections as well, but Karina's also mentioned that. And that is part of the complex interwoven relationships that we're talking about here. Very complex, and it's part of what I struggle with in terms of complicity.
Well, thank you both for reflecting on that, and yeah, I mean, I think what both of you have said really underscores how important it is to read, these texts that undo the sort of binaries of how we think about some of these dynamics too, because as you say, it's a complicated, very complicated sort of set of relationships and histories intersecting in these ways.
Also thinking about what Bertrand said about writing as an assertion of belonging, and even doing research as an assertion of belonging. You use this phrase, Bertrand, to prove I belong. I'm not sure that I do feel I belong on the prairies at the end of the day. That hasn't been what this project has been for me at all. Although I say, I want to drop the receipts and show, it's not in order to prove a kind of belonging to region or nation, because that, those formations to me are colonial. And I don't have any desire in a way to belong to that kind of formation. I think my belonging is to the archive, right? My belonging is to this network of writing and this network of history. And that's my place of belonging. I guess that's how I feel in the end.
Well said. I'll only add that I too don't know that I belong on the prairie, but the desire to prove was the childhood feeling that I had. That's why I call her my unwilling muse, for sure, because she's not sure I belong here either. Yeah.
Thank you all. And just quickly, my question kind of flows from that, because again, I'm struck by these frameworks and by the troubling of the sort of crusty old frameworks. And we're, I'm just thinking of right now and the convoys in Alberta, and just seems like everything that you're saying is so so especially important. So, okay, my question is about, Dr. Vernon, in your book, one of the things that struck me most was your definition of the archive as a network of relations, of social relations. And I think, we see that so powerfully in this conversation. And it just strikes me, when I think about networks of relations, about the framework of the treaty and of the treaties in the prairies, and how, I think I've been trying to come to an understanding of that beyond these like government documents that were about ceding land, and that instead were about an extension of relationship. And I'm just wondering if that framework has been important to you, or if you've seen that in the archives anywhere, or if that's something to think about.
The treaties, thinking through treaties has been important to me, but in a very different way, because I've been thinking about the ways in which Europeans have gone to different places around the world and have established these treaties as a way of creating space making for themselves. And so personally, I have been thinking a lot about Sierra Leone and its encounters with Europeans. And I've been thinking about the ways in which we share histories, Canada and Sierra Leone, Black histories, in fact. We also share truth and reconciliation processes as well. And much of the ways in which we as social but policy-making beings strive to be accountable. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. I haven't really applied it to my Black Alberta specifically, that thinking, but in terms of a diasporic and African diasporic exploration, I absolutely have been, yes.
Thanks for the question, Kiwi. That's a wonderful way to conceptualize treaty, not as, because they have been read by settlers as documents that cleave Indigenous people permanently, on a permanent basis, from their ancestral lands. And as in my reading, they were never understood that way by the people who were negotiating treaty. And so I like that way of thinking about treaty as relation. That's really moving and a really important reframing. I'll have to think about how that understanding of treaty might open up ways of thinking about long-standing Blackness on the prairies too. Like, what is the relationship of treaty to Black folks? I've never presumed to be included in that relationship, in that original relationship as it was originally imagined. But now my conversation with folks, I wonder if there's room to think about spatial justice, I guess, to use that, to bring that phrase back into it in new ways, in a way to like renew those relationships with an understanding of how long Black communities have been on the prairies too. If
quickly you can just share if there are instances of Black joy you found in the archives, because I don't want to think about the negative, like Bertrand mentioned, the negative, how we need to expunge the negative and the historical colonial violence. But are there instances of Black joy that you are uncovering in the archives?
There are, certainly. If there had been time, there was a poem that I actually did write a long time ago, which deals exactly with this. I think part of this is actually in Windows of Our Memories, one of the volumes, but there is a description of, it's one of the Carruthers describes, the Carruthers family, one of these major families who, one of the Black pioneering families of Northern Alberta, describes their get-togethers, just the casual get-togethers. And she talks about the parties they would hold. And I'm actually just trying to pull up my quote just to see here. They would talk about the fish or rabbit on the pot, the parties they would hold, the love they held for each other, the dances that they did, and the language that it's all described in is every other sentence ends in baby. So the parties we had, baby, the fish we had, the rabbit on the pot, honey, and it goes on and on like that. And it just sounds joyful. I mean, it's fantastic. So there's not time for us to go in depth into it, but it's that kind of thing. Yes, they're out there for sure.
Thank you all, everyone who joined us today, for sharing a little bit of your Friday afternoon with us. Karina and Bertrand, thank you so much for your readings. Uche, thank you for your conversation and prompts today. And it was just such a pleasure to listen.